Peppa Pig, Lost Episode, Pause. Everything stopped at 7:42 a.m. Daddy Pig was in the kitchen pouring tea when the spoon slipped from his hoof and froze mid-air. It didn't fall. It simply hung there, perfectly still. At first, he thought it was a trick of the eyes. He blinked, moved, touched the table. Everything felt normal, but only to him. In the other room, Peppa stood frozen with a smile, her hoof reaching out toward George. George, in turn, was offering her a toy. Their faces were still, eyes open, a single moment, captured forever. He tried to speak to them, to touch them. Their bodies were warm but immobile, not lifeless, just paused. He walked through the house. Mummy Pig stood by the stove. Steam from the pot hovered in the air like a dome of glass. The fire below didn't flicker. A droplet from the faucet was caught halfway to the sink. A half-cooked pancake hung from a spatula in mid-flip. Daddy Pig stepped outside. A bird was frozen in the air, wings mid-flap. Leaves on trees were caught in a breeze that no longer blew. The neighbors stood still in their windows. A car sat on the road, unmoving, its wheels no longer turned. Back inside, the minutes refused to pass. He felt no hunger, no fatigue, no urge to sleep, only silence. He tried the television. The screen remained black. The radio hissed, then fell silent. Clocks no longer ticked. He started writing. Pen and paper still obeyed. He kept a journal, though no one would ever read it. He marked days, on walls, on paper, on himself. Day 1, day 23, day 100. Eventually, he stopped counting. Sometimes he spoke aloud, just to hear something. His voice echoed flatly, like in an empty building. He whispered names, Peppa, George, Mummy, but no one ever replied. He tried carrying Peppa outside once. Her body moved, but outside the house she seemed even less alive, like a toy left in the sun. He brought her back in. The house began to smell strange, not decay. Their bodies never changed. It smelled of vacancy, of absence, like a museum long after closing. He tried everything, shouting, running, praying. He broke mirrors. The reflection always showed just him, alone. At times, he thought the air trembled, like time was ready to restart. He watched the suspended water droplet, waiting, but it never moved. Eventually, he understood. This was forever. On the last day he bothered to count, he sat at the table, staring at the frozen Peppa and George. Their smiles had not faded. Their eyes still sparkled with life they no longer lived. He closed his eyes and imagined them laughing.
Peppa Pig, the back room. It all started with a thud. George, as usual, was running around the house with his dinosaur. He laughed, slid across the floor, banged the toy against the walls, until he tripped near the wall under the stairs and bumped his hoof into it. The wall gave off a strange, hollow sound, as if it were empty. Daddy Pig, hearing the noise, came over and crouched down. "What do we have here?" he mumbled and ran his hoof along the wallpaper. It felt slightly raised. Beneath his touch, a smooth, flat surface. A few minutes later, he returned with a flashlight and a knife. He peeled off the wallpaper. Underneath, an old wooden door, narrow, without a handle, cracked and stained with dark paint. "Have we seen this before?" asked Mummy Pig. Everyone looked at each other. No one remembered. No one opened the door. But by evening, it was slightly ajar, just enough for Peppa to feel something, coldness, and silence that didn't belong in the house. She peeked inside. The room was tiny, narrow, windowless, too dark to make out anything clearly. But on the floor lay a doll, very old, missing one arm, and above it on the wall, a message scratched into the plaster. "Sit and wait." The next day, Peppa tried not to go near the door, but George, on the contrary, kept ending up nearby. He stood at the entrance, staring inside. Silently. He didn't play, didn't eat, only stared. Peppa tried talking to him, distracting him, but he didn't seem to hear. That night, Peppa woke up. The house was quiet. Too quiet. The nightlight flickered, and the door to that room stood wide open. The doll on the floor was gone. Peppa stepped forward. On the wall, a new message. "You forgot everything." A click came from behind. She turned around. The door had slammed shut. The room smelled of dust and damp. Shadows moved along the walls, though there was no light. Suddenly, in the corner, the doll appeared, standing, its neck bent, one eye, a mouth drawn in charcoal. "You promised," it whispered. "We played. You left." The room began to shrink, the ceiling to lower. Peppa rushed to the door, banging, screaming. No one came. Then, silence. The room returned to what it was, narrow, empty. The doll was gone. Daddy found her in the morning, sitting on the floor, not crying, just staring at the corner. "Are you all right, Peppa?" he asked. She didn't answer. On the wall, a new message. "Now you are here." The next morning, George walked up to the door. It was closed again, but a piece of paper stuck out from underneath. On it, a drawing. Peppa, sitting in the room, and in the corner, the doll, with a caption, "You'll come too, soon."
The dollhouse one morning, as the sun peeked through the window, Peppa opened her eyes and immediately noticed something new in her room. In the corner, where nothing had been before, now stood a dollhouse. It was large, nearly half her height, with neatly carved windows, tiny doors, and a little roof. But the strangest thing wasn't its sudden appearance. The dollhouse was an exact replica of their home. Every detail was in place. A miniature sofa in the living room, a tiny table in the kitchen, even 2 small beds in the bedroom. But what really caught Peppa's attention were the dolls. Inside stood small figurines that looked just like her family. Mummy Pig stood in the kitchen next to a tiny teapot. Daddy Pig sat in a chair in front of a tiny television. In the bedroom, 2 figurines lay in bed. One looked exactly like George, and the other looked exactly like her. Peppa hesitantly ran a finger over the face of her tiny double. It was smooth, cold, and lacked the softness of a normal toy. The doll's eyes were black, empty. Something about its gaze made Peppa uneasy. All day she kept coming back to check on the dollhouse, watching for any changes. She moved the dolls around, placing them in different spots, but each time she looked away, it seemed like they returned to their original positions. Night fell. Before going to bed, Peppa glanced at the dollhouse one last time. Everything was in place. She pulled her blanket over herself and closed her eyes. Then she heard a soft click, like the sound of a tiny door opening. Peppa sat up suddenly. The room was dark, but the moonlight was enough to illuminate the corners. She looked at the dollhouse. Her heart skipped a beat. The figurine that had been lying in bed earlier was now standing at the door of the tiny bedroom. Peppa couldn't look away. A chill ran down her spine. The doll was moving. Slowly its head began to turn. Peppa's breath caught in her throat. She clutched the blanket tightly, wanting to look away, but she couldn't. The doll's eyes were empty. Then, a quiet creak echoed through the room. Not from the dollhouse, from the real door of her bedroom. She turned her head slowly. The door was open. The hallway was dark, and in the doorway stood a figure. Peppa felt her entire body freeze. The figure stepped forward. Moonlight revealed its face. It was her, but not exactly. The eyes of the other Peppa were black, empty, like the doll's. It smiled. Peppa wanted to scream, but she couldn't. The next morning, the only thing left in the room was a single dollhouse, and inside it, a small figurine. It looked exactly like Peppa, but now its eyes were black too.
Peppa Pig, the White Episode. It was a slow, grey day. Rain tapped gently at the windows. The glass fogged over. The house felt quieter than usual. No walks, no visitors, no noisy games. Mummy Pig sat by the window with a book. Daddy Pig stared at a newspaper, not turning the pages. George silently stacked blocks on the carpet, and Peppa decided to turn on the television. She pressed the button. She expected the usual, a cartoon, the jingle, colour. But the screen was white. Not grey, not static, just a solid glowing white rectangle. No logos, no menus, no sound, no image. Peppa raised the volume. Nothing. Changed the channel. Nothing. Turned it off, turned it on again. Still white. "Mummy, the TV's broken," she said. Mummy didn't turn around. "Maybe it's just bad signal," she replied distantly, still reading. But her voice sounded off, as if she wasn't quite aware of what she'd said. Peppa sat back down in front of the screen. The white light spilled across her face. Not bright, not dim, just constant, calm. And the longer she looked, the more alive it seemed. First, a vibration in the center, then a soft shimmer, then a silhouette. It started as a smudge, then clearer, a figure, standing deep inside the whiteness, no face, no color, almost human but not quite. And then the screen spoke, a low, muffled voice, like from under a blanket. But the words were clear. "I see you watching." Peppa recoiled, turned off the TV. The light vanished, but her skin felt cold, as if someone had been standing right beside her. She turned. George was staring at her, silently. No smile. "Did you see it too?" she whispered. He nodded, just once. Later that evening, Peppa turned the TV on again. She thought for a moment it had returned to normal. But no, white again. Only now it pulsed, like breathing. And within it, shadows appeared. First one, then two, three. They stood still, facing forward, watching. Words appeared over the white. "Do not stop watching." Peppa stepped back. The figures inside raised their heads, all at once. She pulled the plug from the wall. The screen went dark. But the white light did not disappear. The TV was unplugged, but still glowing, and in the glass, her reflection didn't move. That night, Peppa woke up. A faint light poured from the hallway. She crept down to the living room. The TV glowed again, same white, same silence. But now, her own face stared from the screen, distorted, too long, eyes wide, mouth thin and still. It stood behind the glass, looking straight at her. Then it spoke. "Now I see you better." Peppa ran, but as she reached her room, a shadow reflected on the ceiling, tall, stretched upward, following. The next morning, the TV was on again. White screen, soft static. The remote didn't work at all. "Is the TV still acting funny?" Mummy asked casually, but she said it as if she no longer remembered what a TV was. Daddy stepped outside, but in the reflection on the window, the TV behind him was black, and inside it, a figure was still standing. Since then, the television has shown no cartoons, only white, sometimes with writing, sometimes with eyes, sometimes with her copy. Peppa no longer sits close, but she feels it, waiting, and if she looks at the screen too long, it sees her and whispers, "I still see you."
Peppa Pig, my new friend. The sun was shining. A soft breeze rustled the trees in the garden where Peppa played alone. No one noticed when she suddenly fell silent and stared deep into the woods. From that day on, she began to talk about a new friend. She called him Ello. At first, the adults smiled. All children invent imaginary friends at some point, but Ello was different. Peppa said he lived inside her bedroom wall and only came out when everyone was asleep. Each day, Peppa grew quieter. Her gaze seemed hollow. She stopped laughing at her favorite shows and spent more time staring into corners. She said Ello had told her about a place where everything was quiet, where no one ever left. She said they would all go there soon. The first to disappear was Daddy Pig. He simply didn't wake up. Peppa seemed unbothered. She said Ello took him to the garden so he could play there too. Mummy Pig called the police, the neighbors, everyone, but there was no trace of him. Peppa just stared at her with a small, unreadable smile. The next night, George screamed. His room filled with a low, growling hum, and the lights flickered violently. When Mummy and Peppa rushed in, George was gone. No open windows, no sign of struggle. Just a trail of tiny barefoot prints that ended at the bedroom wall. Peppa stood in the doorway, whispering something no one could understand. Mummy Pig didn't sleep that night. She heard footsteps pacing the hallway, slow and deliberate. Doors creaked open and closed. Shadows moved without light. From Peppa's room, faint laughter drifted through the dark, but it wasn't her voice. In the morning, Mummy Pig entered Peppa's room. The little pig sat on the floor, drawing. On the paper, a black, windowless house, 4 pig-shaped figures standing in a circle. In the center, a faceless figure with long arms holding their hands. Above them, in shaky writing, "We belong to Ello now." That night, Mummy Pig disappeared too. No screams, no struggle, just an empty bed, and on the pillow, a child's crayon card, a drawing of Peppa smiling, and beneath it, "Thank you for staying." Ello doesn't like to be alone. The house stood empty, everything left untouched, as if the family had simply gone out for a walk. Only in Peppa's room, something had begun to appear on the wall, the faint outline of a face slowly taking shape. But no one saw it, no one heard, and in the garden the wind whispered, "Ello is here, Ello is waiting."
Peppa Pig. The drawing. George had been sitting at the table longer than usual. His toys remained untouched. Even his favorite dinosaur stayed in the corner. He was drawing, focused, silent. Peppa noticed it in the afternoon. The pencil in his hoof moved carefully, as if he wasn't drawing from imagination, but copying something real. When she came closer, he gently covered the paper with his hoof, then slowly moved it aside. It was a house, unfamiliar, tall, with a jagged roof. The walls were gray, heavy, the windows narrow and dark, and in each one a shadow, a figure, no face, no detail, as if someone was standing inside looking out. Every figure was the same, as if it was one and the same silhouette, repeated in every window. George slowly added a door, large, slightly open. Peppa wanted to ask what it was, but he had already taken a new sheet of paper. The next morning, Mummy was making breakfast, Daddy was reading the newspaper, and Peppa looked out the window. She saw it, the house. It stood at the edge of the field where there used to be only grass, exactly like the drawing. Same roof, same narrow windows, and inside them, shadows, motionless. They didn't look like people or like animals, just silhouettes. Peppa wanted to tell her parents, but Daddy said the house had always been there. Mummy nodded. No one said anything else. After breakfast, the drawing was gone from the table. Peppa asked George, but he only shrugged. He was already drawing a new one. This time, the same house, but instead of grass around it, there was empty white space, as if the world around the house had been erased. The figures in the windows were closer, clearer. Now their heads touched the tops of the windows. One of the figures had a hoof drawn. It reached outward, toward the viewer. That evening, everything felt quieter than usual. When Peppa went to her window, she saw the house again. It was closer, no longer at the edge of the field, almost across from their own house, as if it had moved forward. The figures in the windows were nearer to the glass, and now it felt like they were looking directly at her, still unblinking. Peppa stepped away from the window. On the third day, George drew a staircase. It led from the house's front door, downward, somewhere inside. Too many steps, too steep. He blacked out everything around it, leaving only a dark pit. That night, Peppa woke up. George wasn't in his bed. She went downstairs. The kitchen door was ajar. On the table, a sheet of paper. It was their own house, but instead of windows, black squares. And in each square, the same figure, the one from the windows. repeated over and over. At the bottom of the page, in small letters, U. On the fourth day, she found another sheet. It was her room, the walls, the bed, the window, all exactly right, and at the window stood Peppa, drawn, but the eyes were different, black, no pupils, the mouth, a thin flat line. The figure stood pressed against the glass, hooves on the windowsill. Outside, darkness. On the fifth night, Peppa woke to the sound of paper moving. Several new sheets lay scattered on the floor. One showed the front door of their house, wide open, another the staircase leading down, and beneath the last largest drawing was a careful, almost printed signature, "You're already inside."